welcome everyone to tonight's book launch, hosted by the Academy of Ideas, the Academy of Ideas Parents Forum, and the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Canterbury. So we're very pleased to be working with the Parents Forum and the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies. We had a book launch a number of months ago now with Nancy McDermott's new book, and so we're very delighted to be hosting tonight's online launch for The Corona Generation, the new book by mother and daughter Emma Gilland and Jennie Bristow. And I mean, in terms of prescient books, this one has to top the charts, because it was always going to be the case that young people, education, and schools, and that whole debate was going to take centre stage when it came to looking at the effect of lockdown. But there was just no way of anyone knowing back in March the kind of the situation we are dealing with now. You have to keep, I anyway, have to keep pinching myself and reminding myself that this is reality, that we really have been in this situation for months and months. And God knows what it's been like for young people who have not only had their exams cancelled, some of them their leavers celebrations cancelled, their day-to-day life thrown up in the air. But Emma and Jennie decided early on that this was going to be something that they wanted to take a deep dive and a look into and do some research into. And so they produced early on the book, The Corona Generation, working together to look at how not the pandemic, but lockdown and regulations and the response to the pandemic, crucially, was affecting not just young people, but their interaction with other generations. And so I'll just, many of you on this call will know of Jennie, and some of you will be meeting Emma for the first time, and I'll briefly introduce them, though they've got much longer illustrious bios on our Academy of Ideas website. Jennie is a senior lecturer in sociology at the Canterbury Christ Church University, and she's author of many books dealing with the issue of generational relationships and how politics interplays with the generations and the way that they interact with each other, including Stop Mugging Grandma, Why Boomer Blaming Won't Solve Anything, and of course The Corona Generation. And her daughter Emma is a Year 12 student and has written for Spite on this issue, as well as co-authoring this new book with her mum Jennie, and is actually on the February the 18th speaking on a panel that I am also chairing, which is a new initiative called Free Speech Champions, which is a project run with the BOI charity, which many of you will know, and the Free Speech Union, looking at free speech in relation to students, in relation to young people at school, and fighting for free speech. So very big welcome to Jennie and Emma. At this point, I would just like to say, before we get kicked off, a massive thank you to the Academy of Ideas, and it sounds like I'm thanking myself, but really to the team for continuing to put on these debates and be able to, usually we would be able to have a book launch where everyone would be having drinks and cheesy nibbles at this point. But to be able for the Academy of Ideas to offer to put on this launch and host it and these kind of events has really kept me, and I know lots of people, sane throughout these successive lockdowns. And if you want to show your support, and can at this point show your support financially to the Academy of Ideas, other than following us on social media and sharing all these events with your friends, you might want to think about donating to us, but also supporting us by becoming an AOI associate, which you can find a link to there in the chat that one of my colleagues is going to put in, academyofideas.org.uk/support. Becoming an AOI associate means not just giving us a monthly contribution and showing your support that way, but also when life does eventually, and it will eventually, get back to some semblance of normality, and when we start putting on real life events and that festival, the Battle of Ideas, remember that it's not gone away, it still exists and is going to happen. Becoming an AOI associate gives you a lot of opportunities to get insights and previews and insider knowledge on the festival, so it's really worth considering. Right, all of that aside, how I want to do this, is much like we've done other book launches, is that Jennie, Emma and I will have a bit of a discussion for about 25 minutes. I've got some burning questions to put to them. And then after, we'll have a bit of an informal chat. And after that, we'll come out to the audience for several rounds of questions and answers. The Corona Generation is obviously looking at a particular issue in relation to the pandemic and lockdown restrictions. And I think it's worthwhile us us remaining quite tight in relation to the issues that the book deals with. You can, if you haven't already, get a copy of this book on Amazon. I, like all good millennials, have got it on my laptop, so I can't hold up and brandish a copy. I've got it online. You can buy it on Kindle, online, and in the flesh in paperback. I think it's $7.99, so it's a bargain. Get that on Amazon, and the link will be there in the chat, and it's on the Academy of Ideas website. So welcome, Jennie and Emma, and thank you very much to the pair of you for talking to us tonight. So I want to start off with an impossibly broad question, and maybe it has an obvious answer, but it's unique that you have a intergenerational authorship of a book, number one, but also in particular, other than the obvious anecdotal reasons why you might write this, what was it about the issue of generations and the issue of young people that particularly interested you in writing about this? Because I know that at the start of the pandemic, the whole of the focus was on the elderly, and not necessarily talking about effects on young people. So why was it that the Corona generation was something that you wanted in particular to focus on?
I think from my point of view, having written a lot about the sociology of generations, and particularly looking at questions of generational consciousness, it just seemed very obvious when the whole thing first broke that this is something that would have a really significant impact on the generation coming of age at this time. When Boris Johnson said, yeah, it's the worst public health crisis for a generation, I kind of thought he was right. When he said it will be over by Christmas, I thought he was wrong. I thought that what was happening was something that was, it's a significant world event, and these kind of social shocks do historically kind of forge a sort of sense of, a generation's kind of sense of itself and its distinction from generations older and younger than itself. So I thought it was worth exploring as an idea. And also I had the feeling that lockdown specifically was something that was very, very unprecedented and was quite significant in this regard, because there's no nice way of having a pandemic, right? It's always going to be horrible. People are always going to be unhappy. Authoritarian measures are always going to be used to contain disease. So it wasn't that we were having this pandemic, it was that everyone was talking about this sudden global, and it was a global phenomenon, shutdown, the stop of the world, as saying, well, this has never been done before. And it was a kind of an experiment. I think that's been acknowledged. And it seemed to me that for young people, it would create that very clear schism between life before COVID and life afterwards, and that sense of society deciding that it was going to stop itself and have a pause was quite significant. So that was the sociological reason for writing it. I don't know if Emma wants to say anything.
I think the reason that I wrote it or helped write it at the beginning was that I remember the feeling that a lot of my friends had felt when the exams were cancelled, and I only say the exams were cancelled because that was about approximately 3 days before we got let off school, and just that feeling of everything completely collapsing, just for even if it was that hour of just not having any idea of what to do. And then obviously, as I was in year 11, a lot of my friends and I, we didn't have anything to do for the next 3 months, so really it was the only way to kind of make any sense of what was happening was through writing and figuring out and talking to, because a lot of the book is talking to people, and that's how it was written. The only way to make sense of what was going on was through writing.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you pick up on, and actually Emma, in some of the sections that you contribute to, is this question of I was reading stuff that you were talking about, like the idea of virtual intimacies and the way in which interaction is changing for young people. Anecdotally, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of anecdotes in this session, I think there's nothing wrong with that, actually, because as you say, lots of the book has been framed around talking to people and their experiences. But I remember when I was young, mum couldn't get me off MSN, and I was actually probably the first generation who did lots of my interaction online. When you came home from school, having spent time with everyone all day, you then went on MSN, and so I was wondering to what extent you thought some of the trends that the lockdown has perhaps catalysed were there already. So the question of life moving increasingly online. I mean, I know that, for example, feminists are always talking about the fact that so much of young teenage girls' experience of themselves is through online interaction. I mean, is the lockdown something new, or has it an experience with it, or has it just catalyzed trends that were already there for Gen Z or younger millennials?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning you could definitely say that it did catalyze things, but I think now it's completely changed it, because you don't see young people wanting, like, people don't want to go home and go on their phones anymore. People want to get out. If, like, you have to see, if you are able to see your friends at all, it's for a walk outside. Like, people want to get out. People are waiting for summer to get out. It's completely reversed what people see as valuable and what people see as their space. Before, I think a lot of teenagers saw their space as their online space, but now they want to be separate from their house. They want to be outside. And I think I actually was thinking about this quite recently when I walk around my town, and I don't know whether anyone else has noticed that increasingly people slightly younger than me, skateboarding has become a big thing. And I think that shows that people just want to be outside. And I think so there, it really has reversed a lot of what's been going on, that people are seeing the value of being in real life more than they were before. But I do think that it has catalyzed the whole thing with young people and, like, the politics online. I do really think that that's something that's been completely changed over the lockdown.
I mean, and Jennie, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed, and you mentioned in the book actually, and in some of the articles that you've written around this, is that the relationship between young people and old people has, there were tensions there already in terms of the kind of the separation of young people from their elders and that generational trend. Then there was just this brief moment at the beginning of the pandemic where there were stories of young people, teenagers, not just doing paper routes, but delivering food and taking initiatives. And it was really exciting. And that's kind of all but gone now. But has there been a similar, in the way that Emma says, it's kind of actually, dare I say it almost sounds like there might be a silver lining to it, if it's the case that more teenagers are more likely to want to demand spaces in real life, as it's called. But what has happened in that kind of trend?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I've always been very critical in my previous work of the idea that there is this sort of conflict between generations. I tend to see it as something that's being kind of manufactured as a policy narrative to try and restructure the welfare state. I mean, that's the kind of general line I take, because most surveys show that actually there isn't, young people, older people, that they care about each other in their families. There isn't that kind of conflict on everyday life. One of the things that I found really sad, and again, I think prompted us to write the book, not least because we needed something to do with no exams going on and everything, was that I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I sort of felt there was a real opportunity there to bring young people in, actually, to say, look, this is a massive crisis. Now's your chance, step up, let's look after, older people. They need looking at. And as you say, Ella, there was that moment where that started to happen. And then it was outlawed. And that's, and I use that word very deliberately, that particularly for young people under working age, because a lot of my students, I mean, they've worked in supermarkets through the pandemic. They've done loads of the sort of the heavy lifting as workers. But for younger students, they weren't allowed to do that. And what was worse was that they were very clearly kind of presented as a danger. So rather than being seen as, a resource that could help look after older people, they were kind of pathologized as these sort of asymptomatic germ spreaders. And that makes me very worried, actually, because I think that one of the things that makes me most sad about the way the discussions about the pandemic have gone is that it seems that often, instead of having this separation between people who are sick and people who are well, which is what you'd expect in a pandemic, you've had this separation between the young and the old, for example, as though, little Johnny's going to kill Granny by giving her a kiss. And I just think that is, to me, really troubling. I don't think it necessarily affects how people want to relate to each other in the future, but we've got to bear in mind, I mean, 2 years okay, so it's been a year now, but by the time we kind of come out of this, 2 years in a child's life is a very long time, and how that will affect their kind of ability to forge those relationships with members of the older generation, I'm not sure we can really take it for granted.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you just dig into that a little bit further, I mean, will this, do you think, prophecies at this point are a bit kind of like, no one likes to make them because things are changing all the time. But if you take, for example, that wider trend, so if you, before coronavirus was ever on our lips, the things that you were writing about, Jennie, in relation to the kind of view of old, whereas young people are now seen as the kind of feckless suckers of society's resources for continuing to having raves in Bristol. A year and a half ago, it was old people who were, as you write in the book, bed blockers, and that kind of the disdain for the elderly makes the, calls into question slightly the kind of often it feels kind of almost fake expression of care for them in terms of clapping for carers and all that kind of thing today, because there isn't a sort of direct link for that feeling of solidarity with the old people. But the trend to kind of demonize one section against another and keep that rift and make that, as you say, false distinction between generations, will that, if I'm thinking, hopefully, will there be a surge in intergenerational relationships afterwards? Will there be a surge in solidarity? Or how, Emma, maybe you can answer in your experience talking to people your age. I mean, how does it make you feel in terms of a citizen in society? Does it make you feel more atomized in your age group, or has this made you want to branch out more?
I think it has made us more atomized as an age group, because I think the whole concept of like the effects that it's going to have in the next few years and the effects it's had on our education is very individual to our very specific age group, that no one older than us can know the effect it's had on our education. And the way looking at it as we grow up in the society post-pandemic is very different from those who already have jobs or who have left the job place. It's very, very separate. And I think that because it's been so focused on shutting different areas of the economy, shutting different areas of schools, like everything's just being shut down and put in boxes, and it's not really allowing anyone to see society bigger than that. And I think that's a shame, but I do think it has made us more atomized in an age group.
And yeah, Jennie, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think there's a tension. I think it's very, very difficult, like you say, to give prophecies. And I'm aware that I can sometimes be a bit on the bleak side. I think, it's just been a horrible year, hasn't it? But I think that there's a sort of a balance here, because on the one hand, I think there's that very human need for contact and for intimacy. And I think certainly when we wrote the book, there was a real sense that actually a lot of the young people Emma talked to kind of were really shocked because they realised what they'd missed. There's suddenly not being able to take school for granted, not being able to take for granted that you could see your friends. And there was one quote in the book where one of the girls said, we're just going to be so happy to see each other again, and I think that's still there. I think people on a human level are really quite desperate to connect. On the other hand, I think that there has been something profoundly cynical about this sort of narrative that we're doing this to protect the old people, and those young people who don't get with the programme are being really selfish and they've got blood on their hands and all of that. And I'm very nervous that when at some point the bills come in, there will be some discussion about how, we've got to take the money away from the old people because we did it all for you. And I don't think that's why the response to the pandemic has taken the form that it has. I think there's a number of reasons why it's taken the form that it has, but I just kind of find it worrying when things are presented as sort of clashes of generational rights or privileges.
Do you want to say?
I was just going to say, I also think that I just remembered a conversation I had with some of my friends a while ago, and they were saying, oh yeah, my granny sometimes see her friends, and she's like, oh yeah, I don't really care, like And it's like, I think there's a big difference between older people and younger people in the kind of moral of the lockdown. Like if older people break lockdown, they're putting themselves in danger, so they have on their conscience their own safety. Whereas for us, we've got the narrative of being told that us going out is harming older people, and that's a very different kind of moral question. And I think that's also what's quite dividing, because yeah, it's just not the same kind of responsibility that you have if you're being told you're harming the older generation or that you're harming yourself. Is very different.
Well, I want to ask about the feeling of powerlessness and what that does to not just young people, but a generation that are actively in the process of growing up and supposedly shaping the way they appear in society and shaping society at the same time. But I want to ask one kind of difficult question before that, which is that there's been some kind of discussion on social media. There was an article written about the effect that this is having on kids that caused some controversy. I think it was in the Daily Mail. And there's a discussion about resilience. And there are some people that argue, what about resilience? And then, some people bring up, historical examples of times in history when life was difficult, whether it be world wars, whether it be another kind of challenges, when people bounce back. And there's this sort of idea that the contention is, I know that Jennie, you have argued in the past, especially when it comes to the issue of mental health, about young people, that there being a sort of panic, pre-coronavirus I'm talking about, a panic about young people's ability to be resilient, young people's ability to deal with things like anxiety, stress, change in their lives. Obviously, this is at a very different scale that we're dealing with in the pandemic, and maybe that's your answer. But I have felt myself squirming sometimes when I hear overblown arguments, not in the book that you've written, but in media discussion, about the extent to which children's mental health is in danger, and it can sometimes feel like the only criticism of lockdown at the moment that's sort of acceptable is mental health. And the reason why I squirm is because I think, well, when we get out of this, I'd like to get back to the idea of kids being like bouncy balls. So that tension, how do you kind of tread that balance by not patronizing, as it were, young people at the same time as saying that this is a real thing?
I do think that's a big problem in this discussion, really, and it was one that we were conscious of, and perhaps quite cheekily. We wrote a book called The Corona Generation with a few paragraphs in it that says, but we mustn't be fatalistic. I was worried even back in the spring that there would be this idea that there'd be a generation of kids that were sort of whose life was determined by the pandemic. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And it's a difficult balance to take. But, my understanding of generational consciousness is that it's something kind of significant. It's quite distinct from generational experience, and in our book, we're not writing about all kids, we're writing about a few. We're writing about kind of symbolic narratives rather than, real experiences that need to be kind of studied. And also, with the benefit of time as well. I mean, sort of writing something like this in the moment isn't something that I want to make the habit of. It's very difficult constantly trying to process something immediate. So I think it's true to say it would compound the tragedy to come out with this idea of, this COVID generation that's going to be forever scarred by lockdown. And it would also be an abdication of responsibility, because it'd be a way of society saying, well, because of the pandemic, you've got no future. It was all because of the pandemic, which is actually a way of then saying, it's all because of the old people, and it just feeds that generational conflict narrative. Mental health, I think, is a tricky one, though, because it's also real. There was a mental health crisis amongst young people going into lockdown. And I think the pandemic and lockdown have made that worse. And the reasons for that mental health crisis, that there are many. I can't profess to sort of understand all of them, but when I've looked at this in relation to undergraduate students in a study I did with colleagues, we did investigate all the various sort of dimensions of it. It's like, why is it that students, for a start, a load of them come to university with diagnoses of mental health problems. I mean, many, many more than used to in the past. And then these problems get worse while they're at university. And it's like, well, what are we doing to these kids? You know, what is it about university that's pathological? And one of the things that we identified in that study was that actually, here's the thing with young people, you can't expect them to be resilient on their own. You know, they need boundaries, they need guidance, they need socialization, they need adult authority. And part of the problem that they've experienced, I think, in recent decades has been that kind of erosion of that guidance and of that authority. And what you see in higher education, for example, is I think a lot of young people experience their problems through the prism of mental health, because, you know, the university doesn't know what it's doing. I mean, higher education doesn't know what its purpose is. And young people in that situation are disorientated and confused. And because the language of mental health is the only way in which we explain anything these days, they kind of interpret it all as a problem of them. Okay, so they think it's their problem because they can't cope and that they need to find better ways of coping. And I think that we can see a version of this happening now. I mean, I think there's been a profound crisis of adult authority and responsibility in relation to COVID and young people. And, you know, and that's one of the points that I argue strongly in the book. I think when this crisis hit, the first thing we did was we ditched the kids, and the symbolic effects of that are going to be quite deep and long running. And then having then cast them out of society, out of the guidance of their teachers, their schools, you know, those kind of adult, well, relationships that normally give them at least some semblance of continuity and stability, and then kind of put them in their bedrooms for months on end with nothing but Netflix and social media, and then now telling them that their lives are going to be screwed up forever. I mean, it's not going to be good for mental health, is it? So I think it's a real shame, because I think it has catalyzed that cultural tendency to push young people more and more into themselves and to see themselves as the problem, and the only solution within themselves as finding a better way of coping. Whereas actually, I think we need to be looking more positively outwardly about how we can create a more forward-looking society.
Well, Emma, I would say what you like to that question, but also, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you in particular was there's this quote in the book where you talk to, I think her name's Georgina, she's 11, and she says, she's talking about the cancellation of exams, and she uses this phrase where she says, well, for adults to just turn around and cancel my life in 2 weeks. And I thought, God, that's a bit extreme. And then I remembered what it was like to be at school. And she makes the point that, you know, when you're that age and you're at school, and it's particularly now when almost everything is geared towards exams, you're kind of the crescendo of your young life is about to happen, and then it's taken away. And the kind of the particularly the use of the word cancel there really made me think. But the question of powerlessness that's inherent in that, because I suppose what I was just asking Jennie is, you know, what about agency? How can we start talking to young people again about agency, even in the pandemic? But I mean, if the question is that you have adults who aren't able to exercise their agency, whether it's through restrictions, legal restrictions, or through a kind of this general malaise of powerlessness that lots of us are feeling, how does that affect your ability to feel like you can take control of your life, like you can do something of your own volition?
Yeah, so I think if I just quickly say about the first bit on the mental health, is that what I wanted to say is that I think although there is mental health going on, that there's mental health support for a reason, and that to just say because young people are struggling with mental health doesn't mean that they're not resilient, because I think that a lot of kids and young adults, whatever you want to call us, will struggle, but also then we'll get through it. Like me looking forward to the next 5 years, I don't think that it will make us weaker in the future. I just think that it makes it hard now, and I don't think that's has to be taken as such a bad thing, because I do think just because you're struggling doesn't mean you're not resilient. And I also think that especially the second lockdown, for a lot of young people, from what my mum just said about it being quite isolating and mental health being that you think there's something wrong with you, has actually made a lot of people realise it's not that it's wrong. It's not that they're in the wrong, it's what's going on. So it's like me and my sister talking, oh, it's just because it's lockdown. Like, it's lockdown, like everyone's feeling like this. And I think that has actually had, in a really sad way, some benefit, that less young people feel like they're struggling alone, because there's so much kind of notice that everyone's going to struggle because it's so terrible. So I think that actually, to say that the mental health will cause a wider crisis isn't completely accurate, because I think that young people will get through it, basically. And then, yeah, so the idea of agency, I think that's a really, really difficult question, because first of all, if you take back to doing school, the whole idea of school is to prepare for, to do well, to go to uni, to prepare for a better, future. And the problem with the lockdown is it's not that they just cancelled exams, it's also that universities are not really like universities in the same way. And it's also the fact that obviously everything after university with the jobs, like all of those crazy things in the summer about like so many people couldn't get a job, like 500 applicants for one job. Like, I'm not going to get a job if there are 500 other applicants. I'm just coming out of uni, I haven't got any experience. So I think one of the bigger issues was not just that they cancelled exams, but that everything we were told that exams stood for getting a better job, kind of, it just completely destroyed the whole process. And I think that had a big impact on kind of why we were doing what we were doing. But I think that now, with A levels and people moving forward with their education, it's the kind of perspective has changed, because it's not that they've been cancelled in the same way. It's more that the way we're learning has become a lot more disjointed from what it should be. It's like, I know that one of my teachers always says, like, if you teach me something and that I'm probably going to forget it, but if you involve me in it and I'll learn. And everyone's just not learning in the same way, and I feel like that's not been recognized, that now online teaching is a lot better. So we're learning the content, but we're not going to remember it because we haven't got that interaction, we haven't got that kind of involvement with the subjects. So I think that the issue is not so much with the lack of structural lack of boundaries, that people don't feel like they're connecting with their subject, they don't feel like they're connecting with what they want to do, because it's so separate from what they want to be doing or how they want to be reacting with people. So it makes it just a lot less inspiring going forward.
Yeah, I want to come out to the audience next after I ask my last questions, but there are so many questions I could ask you about the fascinating things that you go into in parts in the book about, the whole concept of online learning, and why, never mind the fact that we, as the news has covered, there are many, 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 many families out there who barely have an iPhone between, 6 kids, let alone enough laptops to spare to do online learning properly. But also just actually what you've just pointed to, Emma, about the question of what school means. And I've been sort of increasingly realizing, though I don't have kids myself, with neighbours who have kids, what a kind of sanctuary school is actually for parents and kids, and how important it is having that separate part of your life, and how you just cannot replicate that. I mean, I know through what I can hear in the wall, you can't replicate that in a sitting room. It's torture, it's impossible. But maybe people in the audience can ask questions about that, because the one I wanted to end on is, and this is the tricky one, what is the solution? And now I'm not asking you to make a prophecy, and I'm not asking you to outline a kind of 5-point plan, build back better, new slogan for the government. But more broadly, what is it? You've already mentioned things about the fact that as someone's picked up in the chat, this great quote that you gave, Emma, about just because you're struggling doesn't mean you're resilient. And I don't think, Jennie, you said you were feeling bleak. That doesn't sound like a bleak outlook. But what is it about the way in which young people see themselves, or the way in which young people are being told to see themselves throughout this pandemic, that has to change? What moving forward as we come out of this, what are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about? Either of you and both of you.
You can start.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've just got to stop seeing young people as the problem and start seeing them as part of the solution, and give them more trust, give them more respect. You know, they demonstrated that at the start, and actually all the way through, despite these, you know, sort of ridiculous overblown headlines about raves and kids on the beach and whatever, actually it's pretty minor stuff. You know, most young people have knuckled down, got on with it, demonstrated real sort of stoicism and compassion. And, you know, even if they are struggling, I mean, you know, I take that point from Emma. I think a lot of the ones who I know, that they are struggling, but they're still moving on, you know, and they're working hard. And, you know, so I think that I just think that's the thing to start. I mean, I think that we need to treat them more as grown-ups. I think the government needs to treat us more as grown-ups as well. I think that's the precondition. It's kind of like we're all kids at the moment, which really isn't going to help us to give young people much in the way of guidance and support if, you know, we're having to watch the news to find out what we're allowed to do day by day. So yeah, trust the kids.
Yeah, I think going forward, one of the big things is that we need to make sure that people have something to, like, there needs to be some kind of end to something or some kind of hope. So I think the thing is, at the moment, everyone's still got this hope of summer, everyone's still got this hope of things going forward. And so I think, from what I can see, as long as there's still some kind of ability to get out and move on, then we'll be like, that'll be fine, because people really are just trying to get through it, and that is so fundamentally important that I think the worst thing we could do is just not keep going forward. But I think also people need to look at the issues that have been brought up in the pandemic that are so not separate from the pandemic, but they're not issues of the pandemic, they were separate. And the fact that a lot more people know a lot more and are a lot more involved with the issues of society that have been brought up by the pandemic, I think going forward we need to take those forward too and act on those issues. For example, a lot of the things that, like you said, about like some families don't have a lot of technology, and a lot of the things about like the free school meals thing, a lot of people my age and even younger than me had a lot to say about those things, and are a lot more aware about a lot of issues than I think they would have been if we hadn't been in a pandemic. And I think that going forward, if we're going to learn anything, it's that people need to stay aware and stay like active on issues to kind of make sure that if there are issues, like, I'm not going to say if there's a pandemic in the future, but if society kind of struggles in the future, that these issues can be solved and people feel like they can have a say in how it goes forward.
Fantastic, great. Okay, take a break, the two of you now, and we'll take some questions from the floor. I have just an announcement to everyone, I have the ability solely to mute and unmute, so fingers off the buttons. I'm going to be trying not to be school momish about this. But Ellie Lee, I will take you first, so I'll unmute you, and let's hear your question.
And thanks very much for organising this and doing so with the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies. It's that I wanted to ask about, really, your parenting as part of all of this, and picking up on the point that Jennie made about how at some level in this situation we're now in, we've all been turned into children. And what then happens to the whole question of parental authority and parenting, and how people see how that pans out now. I mean, the peculiarity of it, of course, is that parental responsibility has been expanded in a very peculiar way, hasn't it? Because we're all now having to do everything. Including, I think, particularly for younger children, it must be very difficult, be their teachers. And, you know, with younger children, unless you're in a situation where you can guide and direct their learning, the possibility of online learning at all, I think, is really impossible. A little bit different to older children, perhaps, although there it's obviously very deficient also. But anyway, there's this clear expansion of what parents are being expected to do. But at the same time, parents really have no authority in any general way to make any decisions about anything. I mean, you can't really ground your children, can you? We're all grounded. You can't really do anything. You can't make any decisions freely about anything anybody's doing. And I think it's a very peculiar situation that we're then in, with that aspect of the relationships between generations. Anyway, I was wondering what people's thoughts were on that.
Great, thank you, Ellie. We'll take Jon Bryan next.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just wanted to comment on this thing about going forward and what next and what the things are to look for, really, because I think if you cast your mind, for people who've got children, if you cast your mind back to last term, when the vast majority of kids were in school, there were certain things that were done, to try and, contain the virus and everything else, that were done, which actually divided up children in the school itself. So both in primary schools and in secondary schools, whereas previously people were allowed to mix very freely, that was kind of taken away. People were put into bubbles, people were very much separated out, and one of my concerns going forward is that, some of those things that were introduced in last term may well continue, going forward for the next few years. And I think that's quite a difficult thing, to deal with, and one of the things that we need to look out for. Just one other thing in terms of, I think, well, first of all, great book, Jennie and Emma. And I do like the way that you talk about, you don't want to kind of just cast a whole generation aside. But let's not forget that people often talk about Thatcher's children and the Thatcher generation. And that was kind of used as a kind of excuse to wipe out a whole generation and just say, this is one group of people who behave in a particular way. And I think, going forward, we do need to think about the ways in which people are just going to be, categorized and just kind of just assume that everyone's the same. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jon. We'll go to Jane Sandeman now.
Oh, hi. One of the things I really liked what you were saying, Jennie, about how do we go forward and harnessing that talent and aspiration of young people. And I think earlier on we're saying we could have got young people volunteering and actually engaged with solving the problem rather than being the problem, as it were. But at my work, I work for a homeless charity, and a few young people have said, can we volunteer? Children under 18, sort of between 16 to 18, we would like to volunteer and do something in this pandemic. And they can't volunteer because of the DBS, you have to have, they're seen as vulnerable people in themselves. And so it's just such a barrier and challenge. And it does seem to be, presumably, if now safety has become so overriding, you think that tendency was there before COVID, now safety becomes just the overriding organising principle in society. Does that not present a really huge barrier to us and letting young people flourish, I guess?
Great, thanks, Jane. Nancy next, Nancy McDermott.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts about this. One is that I have noticed that already it seems that, at least over here, there's a sense of young people not feeling like they have much control over their lives. So I've been reading about, there's a new book called The Rules of Estrangement, where it kind of shows that it actually seems to be causing children to become estranged from their parents, because it's the sort of only way that they feel like they can grab some control over their lives is to kind of separate themselves from these people who have kind of arranged things for them for their whole lives. So I worry that this is going to reinforce that. But then there's part of me that thinks that this could be an opportunity, because I certainly know where I am. There's this real sense amongst adults that we have taken something precious away from this generation, and we owe them something. We need to find a way to give them back the experience that's been taken away. And so I've been wondering if there are two things that we could be talking about. One is to sort of use this as an opportunity to talk about what childhood should be. You know, what does a good childhood look like? And it's, you know, it's not this for sure, but it's actually not what was going on before. And the other thing is whether there's anything that we can do at the level of society to come back from this, where we work together with young people to try and to restore some sort of a sense of community, to, you know, to help the economy recover, to, you know, pull things together again. Because I think, you know, I think it's inspiring, that idea of being able to take things forward. And so I wondered about that.
Great, thanks, Nancy. Emma and Jennie, I'll come back to you now, but just, I mean, particularly that point, one of the points that Nancy made there was one that I've been struggling with, which is, I think actually, Jennie, myself and you did a debate on generations once, or there was some discussion about it. And I remember one of the previous generational tensions before coronavirus was the question of housing. And there was this, you know, the whole kind of baby boomer blaming that you've written about extensively, Jennie. And the kind of idea was, you know, young, you know, kind of affluent, aspirational millennials being ticked off at the fact that they couldn't get on the property ladder the minute they got out of university into a good job. And I remember saying, well, you know, welcome to the experience of every working class person ever throughout history. I mean, big deal, you know, kind of, not big deal as in it is an issue, but cry me a river kind of thing. And is it fair enough for critics to make that point now, in terms of there are many kids who, particularly when it comes to education, life before coronavirus was no kind of good quality, and so spending more time at home, where you could even envisage having a bit more attention from, if you are lucky enough to have an attentive parent to be able to deal with it, rather than being in a cacophonous class in a bad school where you don't get much attention at all. Just that kind of tension, and anything else that four people have raised. So come to you two and pick up on anything.
Thank you. Really good questions. I mean, well, just on that point, Ella, I mean, I don't think there's one answer. I think we need to have a discussion. I mean, that's the thing. I think one thing that, you know, possibly in a good way, although it's not very nice when you're going through it, but one of the things that COVID has done is it's thrown a very harsh light on a lot of the problems that politicians, policymakers, and I should say other people as well, have been avoiding and evading for many years. I mean, we've known about the crisis in social care for ages, right? And so we didn't need the pandemic and the virus ripping through care homes to tell us there was a massive problem there. But I really hope that that's something that we can sort out. But I think at the level in terms of social policy in general, I teach social policy, so I get bizarrely geekily excited by it. You know, I do think there's a case for, going back to the drawing board, going back to the post-war beverage reforms and saying, right, we need to reimagine what we need from the welfare state and work out how to make it happen, and stop trying to just patch things up, or, you know, try and kind of get money out of old people's houses to, you know, I don't know, pay off some student debt, or, you know, this horrible kind of piecemeal policy making that has been going on for ages. I think we've seen, you know, the problems in the health service, right? The pandemic has really highlighted those. We've seen the effective collapse of state education, and that's notwithstanding the enormous amount of work that teachers have had to do. It's not about what teachers themselves have been doing, but, you know, the state has essentially said for a year, we're not going to educate your children, because as far as I'm concerned, you know, learning the curriculum through Google Classroom is not the same as education. So that's something. We've got obviously a big problem in unemployment. We've had discussions about pensions for a long time. So I think there's a lot of problems around that we cannot avoid anymore because they've been shown up. And it's quite a good opportunity then to begin a kind of proper democratic discussion about how we make society work for everybody. Do you want to say something before otherwise I'll just rant?
Well, I was just going to say on that, I think that exactly what you've said, that there's so many issues, but what really scares me is we said that they couldn't be avoided, but they still kind of are. So it's kind of this sense of, oh yeah, we could use this to make a change, but actually it's very difficult to see how these changes are going to be made. And the fact that it's like, take the government now, the fact that we don't even know when we're going back to school is kind of like, it's and that's kind of what I meant with hope in the end. I don't think I was very clear that we need hope for wider change and to see some movement of these issues going forward, because again, now I'm being the bleak one, I don't see, without any structure being put in place, how we're going to be able to use this to really move forward with it. And I think that does need to change. Yeah.
And then can I just say a couple of other quick things?
No, please, yeah, go ahead.
So on the point that Jane made about safety and overriding, and I think this is really interesting, because I think another thing that this pandemic has shown the light on is how selective this pursuit of safety is, because actually, you know, the whole year has been about stopping people from dying from COVID. Now that's a laudable aspiration, but sometimes it seems like anything else goes. Deaths from other things don't matter, you know, effects on children doesn't matter. Delaying children's development by a year, their social development, is actually dangerous. You know, I was having this thought the other day when I was thinking, oh, well, you know, sorry, Emma, you won't like this. When Emma goes backpacking around the world, at least she'll be older and I won't have to worry about her so much. And then I was thinking, well, she won't really be older, will she? Because she'll be chronologically older. But all of those experiences that you build up to make yourself independent are going to be missing. And, you know, how, you know, new undergraduate students are going to fare at university worries the hell out of me, you know, as does actually how they fared this year. So I think that there is a real need to look at that question of, you know, that sort of safety first perspective, which normally has been, until last year, was kind of articulated mainly in relation to children. And there's been a lot of people who've criticised that for overprotecting children and not allowing them to develop. And then this year has sort of taken the form, I think, of real kind of political and institutional neglect of children, which I think actually has caused a number of sort of fairly demonstrable and predictable harm. So we should look at that. And on the point about the classroom bubbles and everything, I mean, I should say, I do think that social distancing, particularly early on in the pandemic when we didn't have a vaccine and everything, I mean, so some of these measures were quite sensible. I mean, we're not used as a society to dealing with a massive infectious disease, right? And I think early on people got that, and they were spontaneously behaving in a way so as to try and minimize unnecessary spread of this. So I wouldn't want to say that we, you know, like it's either lockdown or everyone goes back to normal. I don't think that's realistic. But I do think that there is a worry that a lot of these sort of measures that have been brought in, which they're not benign. I mean, having a classroom of kids that are separated from each other in bubbles, it does disrupt the school environment. You know, I've been teaching this term to undergraduate students. I've been wearing a mask standing about 5 meters away from them. No, a visor. They've been wearing masks. Okay, it's doable. It's preferable to online teaching in my view, but it's not what you want. So I do think we have to keep kind of reevaluating these questions of, you know, how important it is to let people interact kind of normally, and not just assume that we'll just carry on with these weird behaviours once we've got the virus under control.
Mm-hmm. Emma, do you want to say anything, or I'll come back out?
You can go back out.
Okay. We've got lots of hands, and I want to keep going. So let's go back out. So Shirley Lawes.
Thanks very much. I've been actually really quite heartened by a lot of this discussion, although there are still lots of things that are clearly problematic. Jennie, I agree with you entirely what you were saying. You finished up saying in your earlier comments about trusting the kids. But, you know, we can't trust the kids if we don't trust ourselves as adults. And I think what you were saying previously about the loss of adult authority is really, really problematic. And even, and I don't mean this as a criticism, even when you're talking about the year that Emma's lost and how she's going to be, you know, handicapped or whatever, you know, disadvantaged by that. careful, because what we're doing, I think, is that we have to really be careful not to be projecting our own anxieties, worries and experiences onto young people, and particularly onto children. Now, you know, Emma's big girl, grown up, and she can make her own mind up what she's going to listen to and what she's not. But I read something on Facebook the other day, a woman who was talking about how, and this is moving into the mental health arena, about both her 3-year-old and 10-year-olds were depressed. And that really shocked me to read something like that. And I thought, well, I won't go into what I thought about, I'll just leave that hanging. And then today I was doing a French lesson with my 10-year-old grandson on Zoom. And he was talking about this artwork he's been doing. And he said, oh yes, it's Mental Health Week this week. And, you know, I'm thinking, do we really need to make young people really quite so aware of these things, or so conscious of these things? And it really did bring home to me something a friend once said to me, that education, and I would think society in general actually, is now more concerned with young people understanding themselves than understanding the world. And I think there's a real conundrum there about how both parents, adults with young children, and most particularly teachers at this juncture, how they really can grasp the nettle and say, look, there is something really important that needs to be doing here, and that is getting back into the classroom and teaching kids. And it may be that they have no exams, and that could be, as you've alerted us to, there could be the opportunity of doing something different, really. And in education, actually saying, right, now we've got the opportunity not to be worrying about mental health, but getting kids more interested in the world out there than the world they've been enclosed in the last 12 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Shirley. I mean, in terms of doing something different, a couple of people have floated in the chat the idea of getting kids to just do another year of school. Someone, I think it was Breach, mentioned that it's a technical point, but the question of, you know, there's a solution to this. Why not just hold everyone back a year? Which, I mean, that seems eminently sensible to me. And I just mentioned something that Lauren has put in the chat, where she talks about, writing from Ellie's account, talking about the fact that the classroom is not just a place where you learn, but she says also an environment that's important for other reasons, asking what is childhood about? Is it about socializing as well as education? So an interesting point there from Lauren. And I will just say, I've seen, and I've flicked through the videos, I can see lots of parents and children or teenagers, and so I'd invite anyone to be brave and give us a point of view from a youthful point of view as well. So anyway, Noah, what's your question?
Brilliant, thank you, Ella. Yeah, there's obviously been lots of discussion tonight about the huge impact on education that lockdown will have on children's futures, but sort of referencing what Jennie was talking about, trying to be optimistic, I thought I'd try and think about the future of Generation Z optimistically, and I was wondering whether Generation Z could come of age through that shared appreciation of education once again. And I think this could happen in so many ways. I mean, I found it amazing how sort of sad children were to have their GCSEs and A-levels cancelled. You know, if I'd been in one of those cohorts, I certainly would have been, but I was surprised how sort of universal that was. So I think they could appreciate education again through the importance of exams, but combined with that, obviously education is about far more than exams and knowledge being forgotten as soon as you've left the sports hall. So I wonder whether actually when kids are back in the classroom again, that would allow them to appreciate the pursuit of knowledge in that way, and critical thinking, and also sort of linking to previous points about schools as an important place of socialization again, whether actually once they're back in schools again, children will appreciate and value education in a way that they haven't before, because I'm not saying that all kids have taken it for granted, but almost it's like sometimes you only appreciate things when you've had it taken away from you. So despite all the perfectly valid challenges and difficulties that have been raised tonight, I wonder whether we can think optimistically about Generation Z, because they'll appreciate education perhaps in a way that those of us that might be slightly older, they'll probably cast myself in Generation Z, never have appreciated it before.
Brilliant, thank you, Noah, for that. It's a really interesting question, contribution. Elizabeth, I come to you next.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Thank you very much for organising this and for the discussion. I think there's two things I want to raise. One is a general one, which is when we talk about the Corona generation, we're really talking about, I personally have very close, you know, basically I'm an aunt, and I have two kids that have been born since Corona happened. So they're babies, and they haven't seen their grannies and they haven't seen their aunties. And so there's really early developmental things going on as well as like 4, 3, 5, 6-year-olds. And their experience of education is very different. And to get them to do online education, you really have to be in front of them, working with them at the computer, which is very different from 14, 13-year-olds or whatever, where you can at least expect them to sit at the computer. And then, so that's my first thing, is that actually, even when we're talking about the Corona generation, we're already talking about babies, 4-year-olds, 15, 17-year-olds. And so they're all having a different experience with this. So that's number one. And number two is that I am actually an educator, and I'm in third level education. And I have first years who have never stepped on campus, have no concept of what that is, have done everything through online. The fall off rate of the students who are just experiencing this bachelor's that they're doing has been much higher, and I think they feel very disconnected. I'm also in the process of teaching people in their final year, and I've just finished the year before that who didn't get to graduate in a physical space. We had a Zoom call with them, and I just think there's a loss here. Even if people see that there's a potential opportunity to change things or whatever, there's a loss here that I don't mean to be pessimistic, but that can actually never really be made up for in these students' lives and these young people's lives, whether it be a little baby who won't get to see her granny or a granddad for another year, and the developmental changes and possibilities of that, or a 21-year-old who didn't get to go to graduation, didn't get to talk to people afterwards. It's so subtle and complex that by the time we're finished with this, I don't think there's one full policy or answer to any of it. And I think we've got to accept the complexity of it and deal with it in different compartments, and not really see it as a generation, because, as I say, even the concept of a baby born during this time, as opposed to somebody who wants to attend their graduation party and can't, they're worlds apart, and yet they're all young people. And as a teacher, I care profoundly about their experience in education, and I'm very frustrated about it because I feel my experience as an educator is really undermined by this, and I would love to get back to teaching. And the general line from teachers' unions, both in Ireland, I'm from Ireland, and my impression is also from the UK, is that they're very resistant, generally speaking, to get back on campus. And I'm not. And it feels like they're speaking for me, and they're not. I'm more than willing to do it. And so if anybody, obviously including the two authors, would be interested in talking about that in particular, I'd love to hear what they said, because I think there's a resistance to going back on campus, and I would like to know what they think about that and the safety levels and all of that sort of thing. So
brilliant. Thank you, Elizabeth. No, that's great. Thank you. And just, I mean, on the question of, just to highlight that, on the question of resistance, I mean, the resistance to going back, but also the resistance to lockdown measures, or the desire to go back to resisting restrictions. Some people have mentioned in the chat, Alison Small has picked out the fact that young people are coming up against the police when they push back against these rules. I mean, there is a tension here, which is that, how do I put it? If society has broadly, I mean, we could have a whole nother row about this, but if society has broadly agreed, to what degree consensually, to comply with lockdown measures, there is a question about responsibility, and there is a question about whether or not you should be celebrating, you know, okay, the handful of Bristol ravers, or, you know, it's happening all the time in London, you know, pockets of young people are being found in garages and really scummy places trying to have parties. But the serious point is there is resistance to it, and political resistance, and voicing your position and exercising your agency, and then being irresponsible and removing yourself from, not just irresponsible in terms of the virus, which is a real threat, but in terms of not taking part in a collective approach to dealing with this issue. Jennie and Emma, I'm going to take, because we're not exactly running out of time, but there are a lot of people who want to speak, so that's a hint to people to be snappy now. I'm going to take Sally Millard and Josephine Hussey, and then I'm going to come back to the two of you, and then we'll go out again one last time. So, Sally, or Dave, whoever it is.
Oh, it's Dave. Hopefully you can hear me okay. That's a really great book, Jennie and Emma. I really enjoyed enjoying reading it for the second time. I mean, definitely share your concerns that what we're seeing is an abdication of adult responsibility. Obviously, some of it willing. So, I mean, I work in the City of London, and it had pretty much cleared out. Before the first lockdown became official. There was like a kind of mad scramble for the exits. And obviously some of it is, unwilling, and people have been kind of forced into lockdown because of the legal restrictions. But it definitely feels like, in general, like an abdication of adult responsibility. And I think you kind of really draw that out in relationship to education and our societal responsibility to educate the young, and for young adults, our main method of inducting them into adult society is through education. That's the kind of the mechanism by which it occurs. As most obviously young people kind of moving on or moving into higher education. And my question, I guess, is what's the how is this experienced? And so probably it's in part as well a question for Emma. How do young people experience this? So I see it as an abdication of adult responsibility, but how is it perceived, particularly by young people? Or does it just appear to be this is the normal thing to do in difficult circumstances?
Great, thanks, Dave. Jo, I will come to you.
I just wanted to say two things. One was I think there's a difference between being an adult in society and being a parent. And as a parent, I've always projected my fears and said to my daughter, are you okay? You've been in your room all this time, and she's like shrugging me off. So I think, like Emma said, children and young people are more resilient than we give them credit for. And I'm really heartened by what Emma said about the positivity of the fact that they can cope with it. And I really don't think that what Noel said is going to happen, that the young people that can come back and say, oh, I really value education. I mean, when I'm a teacher of primary school at the end of primary school, so year 5, 6, and they came back, and for about the first week in the summer, they were all like, oh, we're so pleased to be back. And then, within a week or two, they were back to their old tricks of avoiding me and not listening and all the things that they do to push the boundaries. And that's the point, really, about young children, is that they need boundaries to push against. And I think that's the biggest problem that we've had, is that, in the past, it was kind of big issues like climate change that we were asking for their advice on. And now we're saying, you've got to stay away because you're causing or helping to cause a problem that is COVID, and particularly in schools. It really worries me. We talk about keeping children safe, but actually what we're doing at the moment is keeping adults safe by keeping children locked up at home. And the children have kind of been lost in all of that. So I think that's a real problem. I mean, as for Mental Health Week, obviously these assemblies have been passing across my email exchange, and I've been ignoring them, because for me, the best advice to teachers and parents for mental health is boundaries, interesting ideas, and children will thrive really from that. I think that what we need to think about is how we create from here, and I'd be really interested in what Emma and Jennie think about this, how we actually create something objective, because for me it feels like things are unraveling slightly, and I, as a teacher, and I watch the children on my Zoom lesson every day, all having very different experiences, and
interpreting my instructions for their work very differently and sending me very different things in. And in a classroom, I can ensure that they have very similar experiences. I can level up those that I need to, and all of that kind of thing. And I think generally across society, one of the things that worries me is that things are unraveling and becoming more disparate, and how we are going to bring something much more objective with boundaries back in place. And I'd particularly be interested in what Emma thinks about that.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Jo. Right, throwing it back to Jennie and Emma, the two of you, and you. I'm not going to give you masses of time, so just make a couple of points each, and then we'll come back out and rip through these 8 people with their hands up. So over to you guys.
Yeah, so if I just start with kind of what Dave was saying, and I was kind of thinking about this before, is it really an abdication of adults, or like it's not really the abdication of adults, because I'm still obviously with my mum. I'm still obviously as close with my mum and my parents. I'm still maybe even my school. I know that my school is putting in a lot of effort to try and get people learning, get people in, get people registered, make sure that they can give young people what they can online. It's not the same, but they're trying. So I don't think that it's necessarily the abdication from our point of view of adults. I think for a lot of people we've been brought closer to adults because they're in the same situation as us. They're trying to figure this out as much as we're trying to figure it out. So I don't think that we see it as a failure of the adults, apart from we see it as, like, put it frankly, the failure of the government. Like, they're in this situation because the government put them there. We're in this situation because the government put them there. So I think that to say adults in general is too general, and that moving forward, I think a lot of the issues of which people have raised with the difficulties with education and is that what we're realizing is that not everything can be solved from the kind of the superstructure of society which we would see as policy and stuff. It's not going to solve everything, and that actually to be able to move forward as a society, there needs to be some kind of movement away from this reliance on policy and reliance on safety and reliance on just absolute structure, because it's just showing that it's not going to go very far, and that we can't rely on it because it's just not going to enable us to develop and make the use of each other and society and what we can bring to younger generations in the way that should be most beneficial. So I think if we take anything away from the pandemic, it is that society needs to take more initiative in ensuring its own development and using what we think as the key things and make them important again. Like, for example, if you look at education and like the issues with kids being disengaged, maybe that's to do with the way that education is taught in general, and that if we were to change the curriculum and kind of broaden things out, would we engage kids more? Would they be more interested in the wider world? Would they feel like they have a place because they know what they're interested in, where they want to go? And I think that's what we need to take responsibility for, making them feel like they have somewhere to belong and something to be interested in.
Okay, and then on the question of keeping kids back a year from school, which I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, I think we should let them if they want to, but I think we should, this is the thing, I think coming out of this, we've got to have a proper kind of re-evaluation of what we're doing with education. I mean, we've been keeping kids back a year from school for years. That's why half of them now go to university until they're 21. We don't let them leave school until they're 18. You know, and a lot of this has been motivated by this sort of sense of, well, we don't know what else to do with them, rather than by education itself. And then we've fed them this line that education is really important, so you get your qualifications, so you can get a job, and then we cancel their qualifications and tell them there's no jobs because of COVID. So I don't think just kind of extending it is going to work, and that's why I really, really do hope we can start having some sort of honest discussions about what's possible and, you know, what we mean by education, and get around this kind of idea. It's just all about kind of getting qualifications and everything else, and bring some content back in and some proper intergenerational interaction. I also think, I mean, this relates to Ellie, you were saying about that tension over what it means to be responsible. You know, is it responsible to kind of G your kids up to go on a rave and all of that? And I mean, and it is something that really bothers me, because even though I'm stroppy, I'm actually quite a big believer in social norms and rules and compliance. And part of my worry about the way we've been with young people over this past year is that I think it really corrodes that. You know, I think when you're confronted with a dangerous infectious disease, you want to encourage them to behave sensibly. You know, and the best way of doing that is actually not by locking them away in their bedrooms and refusing to talk to them and sort of shaming them and blaming them and everything else, because I worry that that is just going to lead to sort of cynicism. So part of my reason for, funnily enough, I mean, for opening the schools is I don't think they should be open just to be treated as kind of arms of the public health state, which that bothers me as well. But I think it's really, really important as part of this effort to kind of get through the pandemic and move on, to bring kids back into that sort of more socialized forum and discussion.
Brilliant. Okay. Right. So I've got 8 people with their hands up, and this is going to be the last time we come out to the audience. So I'll just say that Jennie and Emma are not going to get to answer every single question, which the only reason I'm saying that is that don't feel the need to cram it into a question. If you just want to make a contribution or make a point yourself, do so. But let's, in a snappy fashion, get through these. So we'll begin with Linda Murdoch.
Hi, Emma, I just wanted to ask you about something you said that I found really interesting. You said that around the mental health issue, that it was almost like because your generation were having a shared experience, that they stopped living in their heads and thinking that this was all about them. And there wasn't. The reason why I'm asking is I had a very similar experience in my research during the COVID crisis, asking students about how they felt about it in relation to their job prospects. And there wasn't this outpouring of anxiety and stress the way we would have expected it. And all of them said that this is a great leveler, that the pandemic had made them realise that the way they were feeling had a real material, there was a real reason for it. And it wasn't just about, you know, them, and it's all their fault and it's all about them. And I just wondered if that's a useful way of this generation being able to get through this, that they can actually see that this is something that they're all in together. And you know, and it will help their resilience. I mean, I hate the word resilience, but you know what I mean. It will. It is an experience, and it's something to go through, and it's something to endure. So I just wondered what you felt about that, or if you say a little bit more about that.
Great, thanks, Linda. Yeah, if there was ever something to put angst and anxiety and stress into context, it's a real public health crisis, you know. Okay, Alka Sayal-Cuthbert, to you next.
So many things have become clear in this pandemic that you kind of perhaps knew about or semi-intuited before. I don't think it's just it's not just a biological crisis, and I don't think it's just even a political crisis of leadership. You can see that we've got a crisis in terms of the media that has failed spectacularly to play the kind of public role you would hope it to play. And also, you know, a kind of almost like a sort of cultural crisis. And I do take Shirley's point very much to heart about the danger of imposing our own anxieties onto the young, because I think whatever happens at the end, you know, it's like, I don't think we're going to find the answers or we're going to do any favors if we focus exclusively on the young as if they were separate from us. I think how they will react, how they will respond, and the possibilities that will be open to them will depend on us and on how we act as adults and how we become, you know, make ourselves fulfill our role as the responsible adults we all, I think, hope to be and want to be. And that really just touches very quickly, reminds me, Jennie, you mentioned going back to really big basic ideas, and you mentioned Beveridge in 1944-45. And the thing that is really strikingly, for me, one of the most important differences between then and now is that loss of democratic culture. You know, we do need policy making, but we need policy making that is democratic, where the chains of communication and relationships between the local, the care people running the care workers, the regional health authorities, and then the national policymakers. All those things have broken down, and government has got out of practice. I don't hold that the government is like a wicked thing trying to, suppress us all. I think they are probably trying to do the best, but they kind of they themselves are completely at sea. So I think this is sort of how young people will react will, I think, depend on how we react. And if we can try and look to ourselves and see how we can rebuild our lives in an adult world that's worth living in for all generations, that will probably be the best thing we can do.
Thank you, Alka. Great. Joanne Williams next.
Yeah, another quick point on the mental health issue. So Jenny, I really agree with what you're saying at the beginning about these being around mental health and other discussions kind of predating coronavirus and predating the lockdown. And certainly awareness around mental health was something that we were promoting with children long before the current pandemic. I do wonder to what extent, and this relates to Shirley's point perhaps about people describing 3-year-olds and 10-year-olds as suffering from depression, to what extent in that build up, in the years building up to where we are now, we have destigmatized through a concerted effort issues like depression, anxiety, mental health problems with young people, to such an extent that the flip side of that is that actually emotions like being lonely, being miserable, being bored have kind of become stigmatized. For one thing, we've kind of taken that vocabulary away from young people. Another thing I worry about is that perhaps to say that you're lonely or miserable or bored kind of seems like a personal failing, even during the current situation of a pandemic, that you should be busy baking banana bread or kind of doing an online workout or something like that if you're feeling lonely and bored. Whereas actually, I think those are very normal responses, normal emotional responses to the current situation. But I think this real kind of a very peculiar situation going on where we're told that locking down is a kind of communal, collective response, that we're all in this together, that this is how as a society we're responding to this. And yet it's experienced as the most individualized solution imaginable. We retreat into our own homes. As parents, we draw upon our own resources. It's literally the surroundings of our own house. And we as individuals are expected to deal with this either as parents or as young people. And I do worry that if we can't, then this is presented either as a mental health problem where you are legitimately allowed to call upon external support, or as just an individual weakness.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. Coming to Tom and Kelsey next.
I was really heartened to hear actually both Emma and Jennie talking about kind of what happens after the pandemic, what happens in terms of sort of political activism. Particularly heartened to hear Emma do that because actually I teach her politics, so that was nice. One thing though I do wonder about is and I'm sort of feeling that way too, but on the other hand, there's another danger too, isn't there? That I was talking to Ed Dorrell, who I know very well, on Twitter, and he made the following comment, which I thought interesting the other day, which was, I'm really looking forward to a day where there isn't any news. And actually, particularly with COVID backing on, if you like, to Brexit and various other events that have been very tumultuous, Trump, etc., etc., I wonder if actually there's a danger of us going the other way, of us all just being so desperate to get away, to go on holiday, to go to the pub, to see our friends, to go shopping, to whatever else, that actually in the next few years, actually we look for the politics of the boring, that actually we sort of, we gravitate more towards the Keir Starmer type politics, if you like, and actually don't take on the kind of challenges that Jennie's talking about kind of the beverage, sort of a new beverage report, that kind of thing. I love that vision, but I wonder if you see that danger too.
Great, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I mean, if you're, and it's not just young people, as an adult, if you're constantly kind of waiting for the press conference to tell you what you can and can't do this week, then it does sort of, you do find yourself longing for, oh, can Boris Johnson just, I don't know whether I'm able to go out, can you just tell me? And there's a sense of, are we going to remain in that kind of dependency, or are we at some point going to say, no, we make the rules now? Okay, whiz through these last four now. No pressure, but be a bit snappy. Samuel Barrett.
Hi. So I had a point, but I did want to maybe hear Emma's thoughts on it. Speaking as someone who is Generation Z and who is at university, who's an undergraduate, I was wondering, so, you know, when I grew up, you know, I saw the internet definitely as a democratic tool, and as something really beneficial to education. I felt that that narrative was always around with sort of other young kids and just how we saw the internet. And what I saw a lot now is just with the conversations I have with friends and I just hear around is that, you know, the internet has almost become this, or just genuinely when we talk about online education, we always speak that, you know, it's a negative, it has so much negative impact, it's not democratic at all, you know. And I was wondering if perhaps, you know, we would, as the conversation was going, it felt a lot like younger generations are going to, you know, grow up with maybe sort of pathologies because of the lockdown. But, you know, maybe we were pathologized before, even, you know, as being an antisocial generation, a generation that was constantly, you know, on the internet or other things. And I think maybe is there a reclamate, are we going to, you know, our generation will have maybe sort of want for like the physical commons, or just generally something that is actually more social, more beneficial to maybe that sounds romantic, but I was wondering to hear Emma's views on that, and if that is the sort of ideas going around her circle of friends or her age group.
Great, thanks very much, Samuel. Fiona Cleary next.
Just on the mental health thing, I thought Shirley said something when we were talking about how down everybody has been lately, and she said, oh, be careful because, you know, they're quite resilient. I just thought that made me think of something really important, which is just this really difficult balance to strike as a parent between being kind of attentive and responsible on the one hand, and then not overindulging on the other. And I think anyone who's kind of wary of that is just constantly walking this tightrope, and it's really difficult thing to strike. And I think it's really important to, I've talked to so many people over the last couple of weeks, and pretty much everybody of every generation has sort of hit an all-time low, I think, over the past couple of weeks, and hopefully we're sort of coming out of it now. But they're all demonstrating what I would say were perfectly mentally healthy responses to a completely insane situation. And I think it's really important to reiterate that point to younger people as much as possible. And but just to end on a more positive note, actually what I have observed is at the same time as feeling very, very low and feeling like, oh my God, I don't think I can renew my enthusiasm to pull myself up again, you know, this third time around in that generation, I have actually sort of seen an amazing maturity, just in, you know, in terms of dealing with independent learning and the kinds of things you wouldn't be grappling with till you're at university. Perhaps, but generally also in terms of how to structure their time and stuff. And certainly listening to people like Emma talking, it really renews my faith in that generation that, you know, all of these issues and problems that we're talking about having to deal with on our way out of this, certainly listening to Emma makes me feel a lot more confident that the next generation will be really well equipped to deal with that and very mature as a result of what they've been through. And that's what I've observed among my kids and my friends' children as well. So I think there's hope.
Yes, well, I agree with that and second that point, Fiona. Anna Keenan, you're next.
Yeah, I guess I want to raise my concern that this the amount of policy that's been introduced and the amount of regulation is going to have an impact in that it will be an excuse for kind of people of authority to exert more control over young people. So particularly at university, where I am right now, I find that there's a lot more security around under the kind of guise of it being to prevent people interacting because of social distancing. But I get the impression that maybe something more sinister going on, because obviously they don't want to have parties, they don't want to be so much interaction going on in that sense. And I just worry that in institutions that are increasingly infantilizing their students more, this can be used as something quite sinister to control young people further in the future.
Great, thanks Anna. Thanks for that. Georgina Newcomb now.
Okay, so my question sort of builds on something that Emma said earlier about young people being sort of fed up of living quite insular lives and spending all our day on Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat. and kind of now being fed up of using social media so much. I'm just wondering what the authors think about how young people are going to bounce back and respond from this. Do you think, which force do you think is going to be sort of more powerful once we're back to some sort of normality? Is it going to be the kind of potentially irreparable damage of missed education, missed opportunities for development, missed social contact? Or is it going to be our sort of changed and evolved attitudes towards social media and social life? You know, this impact of limited social contact, how is that going to change our attitudes in the future? Are we sort of going to bounce back from this and feel kind of a renewed sense of gratitude every time we can socialize, every time we can kind of have spontaneous social contact? Are we going to sort of enjoy ourselves more, put ourselves out there a little bit more? Or is this damage going to be sort of irreparable? So are young people going to be kind of crippled by anxiety or lack of confidence, or are we going to feel kind of rejuvenated and bounce back from this kind of better than ever?
Great, thank you. Really interesting challenge there to what the exit plan, as everyone's calling it, might look like, both in terms of the technicalities of this and the idea of what politically our outlook should be. So Jennie and Emma, I'll come back to you. I mean, just picking up on your final thoughts and points that people have raised in the chat. I mean, Mo Lovett raises a really important point, which is which I think we've sort of some people in their contributions have been alluding to, which is the difference between what has always been the case about the generational tensions and what has been exacerbated throughout the pandemic. So some people have mentioned, we've caused a bit of a stir by suggesting that we might hold people back a year. Some people suggesting that teenagers would be outraged by this. I mean, Jeannie, teenagers have always been outraged, haven't they? It's part of the process of being a teenager that you live in a perpetual stage of either, depression or outrage. You kind of bounce between the two of them. And so the point that Fiona raises about this, the particularities of people's subjective experience of this, and Joanna alluded to this as well. I mean, one young person or one family, this might just be, you could see the pandemic as a bump in an already very bumpy road, and they might be more resilient to it than let's say, for example, more middle-class kid who, for this, is a break in what has previously been a rather perfect life and therefore feels more catastrophic. It's not to diminish the feelings, but the subjective nature of this makes it very hard to make broad political points. And I suppose what I'm asking the two of you, Jennie and Emma, to finish with is anything you want, but can we make kind of broad political points on this, or not projections, but in a positive way, generalizations of how it is that young people should be thinking about themselves, and actually, as most of the contributions have pointed out, how adults should be thinking about themselves and their relationship to young people coming out of this. What lessons can we learn, and what is particular to this current moment? And so throwing it out to the two of you now for 5 minutes to pick up on anything you like.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to go first and let Emma have the last word. I don't think it's all over. I don't think it's all bad. I mean, I want to stress again two things. First of all, that what we were doing in the book wasn't providing an account of an entire generation's experience, which would be impossible, particularly sort of at that time. It was quite a specific thing that we were looking at. And also just to stress that I really don't think you can criticise lockdown on the basis that it makes young people unhappy, right? Because it makes everyone unhappy, and the pandemic will have made everyone unhappy, and day after day of death and misery, and it's horrible, right? So in a way, I think there's sometimes this sort of kind of idea that you could that what you should be doing is contrasting normal life with the problems now, and that was never an option. The only question when the when the pandemic broke wasn't, it was how life would change. It wasn't, would it change or not change? Of course it would change. And my kind of concern is about the ways in which I think it has changed to be quite destructive of a lot of things that we hold very dear in our lives: intimacy, authority, the intergenerational, responsibility, and has also, I think, arguably made it less effective to deal with the pandemic as well. I just want to make a couple of little points on Anna's point about sort of mission creep. universities. I do think that's a danger, and I want to link it to something that April has raised in the chat about how basically, is it just like, you know, people just don't like young people, they don't like teenagers, and this is like open season on teenagers. And I do think it's interesting because the way young people have been talked about recently reminds me of how they were talked about in the 80s. And then there was this period where it was almost like everyone wanted to gush about young people all the time, and adults were sort of almost like told that they had to pat kids on the head, and they were discouraged from doing stuff that's quite important, like telling them off for bad behavior, or, you know, just generally kind of playing a role. And I think in a very kind of weird and warped and quite disturbing way, partly what's happened is that the pandemic has sort of given the excuse for a sort of a way of criticizing teenagers for bad behavior without having to take responsibility for it. And I think that is really, I do think it is really awful. I mean, April talks about treating kids as germs on legs. I think it's been really dehumanizing, and that needs to have a lot of thought. And I think, you know, in relation to Anna's point, I think there is this sort of sense of yeah, we don't know what we're doing with students, so it just then becomes a rationale to sort of use more and more kind of measures under the guise of infection control, but actually just to sort of try and keep a bit of keep a bit of order. So I think that's unfortunate. And finally, I mean, I would really love a day with no news. You know, I made this joke to my students, you know, back last spring about how, you know, I like studying sociology and not actually living it, you know, and it has been like this kind of relentless experience of constantly having to, like say, you kind of mired in death and, you know, confusion all the time as you're trying to work out what to say. And I actually see some kind of merit in the idea of the politics of the boring. But I think what I would mean by that is I would like to get back to a situation where we can have a proper, calm, democratic discussion that's not all about echo chambers, you know, shouting at each other and tweeting and trolling and all of that, where we are kind of trying to sort of say, well, we have a common interest within society of trying to deal with these problems. I don't think that means Keir Starmer for me, because I think the other lesson of this year has just been about how cruel technocracy can be. You know, if you take one metric and you try and apply it, reduce number of infections, and that becomes the rationale for overriding so much else and clamping down on so much else. I think it does show that actually what we need is more sort of temperate, considered discussion with each other, and particularly with people that we disagree with.
Right, so there are quite a lot of points that I feel like I would quite like to address. So the first one is actually the one with policy control. I just wanted to mention actually something I heard from Ella on a podcast, where she said that it's not just young. She mentioned about drinking and how there was a regulation on pubs, and that's not got anything to do with lockdown. That's just to stop people drinking. And I feel like that's a big thing. Like, yes, it's controlling young people, but what of the policy is just trying to have more control over people's lives anyway. So I think that definitely is one of those things that, yes, it has had a big effect on young people, but also that is a much broader issue. And then I think I have to disagree with my mum on the when there's no news, but that might just be where I am. I do not want to go to a place where there's no news, because I think, frankly, a lot of people our age do not trust the government and want to know what they're doing to kind of find a way to make it change and make something different, because if there was no news and we didn't know what they were doing, God knows how much wrong it would go. And then I think one of the big things with mental health and the stigmatization is just that it gets very confusing with what is a problem, as in what is a problem, as in it's a problem of your life, and what is genuinely a problem with yourself. And that, so a lot of being it's like what Joanna says about feeling lonely and bored, it feels like you're failing. And what a lot of people have said about, oh, it's just a teenager. So I actually thank my parents for going, you're just a teenager, because although you might go, oh no, I'm not a teenager, I'm like, yeah, actually you are a teenager. And it makes you realize that like it's kind of a lot more natural. And I think that's the issue with a lot of the thing. I think mental health awareness is really key, but if it's brought in when kids are too young, that then they just think every issue is a mental health issue when it's not. So I don't think the mental health shouldn't be addressed. I think that it needs to be recalculated in how it's addressed to a lot of young people. And I think what I wanted to say about the thing with the exams is I think there's really not, although a lot of people say exams are stressful, they don't realise how much pressure a lot of young people put on themselves with exams and university, and that's where a lot of the mental health issues in education have come from. And because of the individualised and competitive nature of education, that no matter how much you talk to your friends about it, you never feel like you are able to talk to them about it because it's just so competitive. And that's why I think I'm sorry, I can't remember who it said about that whole idea of like leveling up, is that it became useful because you didn't have to feel like you were on your own. You didn't have to feel like you were competing with everyone else, because it got to a point where you were all just thrown under the bus together, and it just took a lot of the individual and isolating pressure off, which put it in a very weird situation where you were entirely isolated, yet almost less isolated in what you had some time to breathe. And I think the last point I wanted to make was on how a couple of years ago the internet was seen as a massive tool to increase democracy and to increase discussion, and how that's kind of been tainted. I think the reason is that it's been taken for like politics online, it's been taken to kids too young. Kids of the age of 11, age of 12 were expected to know, expected to participate, and they were in things like the Black Lives Matter movement when they didn't really understand. And I don't think they should have had to felt the societal pressure on social media to interact in those issues. And I think that the kind of, although positive aggression in people were passionate about the issues and wanted to make a change, made it quite scary. And I think that's really the issue that came out with politics and social media, that it got changed from something that should lead to discussion to something that kind of led to less discussion because people were too scared to say anything that was wrong. And for a 12-year-old to be in that situation and in their bedroom, not able to talk to anyone about what it really means, made it a negative experience. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to the pair of you. You end the book with, I think it's Emma writing. I think actually, Jennie, you can see that Emma's more optimistic view will win out at the end of the book. And you say that, Emma, that one thing the lockdown is, okay, you were writing a number of months ago, but I think it's still true given what the tenor of the discussion tonight, that you say one of the things lockdown has taught us is that we can have choice in our lives and our voice and the paths we take even in these very trying times. And so I think that's worth remembering as something, as an outlook that is not exactly bleak, but actually it has got some hope for it. One choice you can all make tonight is to buy a copy of The Corona Generation on Amazon. It's available, as I said, ebook for those of us who want to, the more environmentally conscious of the youth, and in paperback. So get it wherever you get your books. Thank you very much to Jennie and Emma for a really fascinating discussion. I'm going to ask everyone to unmute and join me in giving you a round of applause.
Thank you, Ella, for organising and for everyone for coming. It's been really nice to sort of see you.
Usually this is usually where you would be signing books and drinking and all those kind of things.
Still drink.
We'll just say
we're drinking anyway, so.
Well, there you go. Yeah, we'll deserve one. And just a final thank you to the Parents Forum, to the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies, which Jennie is heavily involved with, for partnering with us on this. There's lots more that both Jennie and Emma have written that you can look up as well as buying the book. And I will just plug one last time that Emma will be back on Zoom on February the 18th for the launch of the Free Speech Champions as a panelist, and the link is in the chat for anyone who wants to attend that, a discussion about free speech and young people and students and universities. So there you are, the links in the chats. And if anyone does want to become an AOI associate, support the Academy of Ideas, head to our website and the support button, donate, give us what you can. But otherwise, have a very good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight, and buy a copy of The Corona Generation.
Thanks very much.